Date, December 7th, 2019. Location, Central City. What happens when something as simple as a burger disrupts an entire neighborhood? For years, the suburb was peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, waved from their porches, and shared small talk on weekend mornings. At the heart of this harmony was Frank Wilson, the perfect neighbor, or so everyone thought. Frank was a white man in his late 40s, always immaculately dressed and quick with a charming smile. He helped the elderly with their groceries, organized block parties, and kept his lawn immaculate. His neighbors admired him, but none of them knew the simmering hatred hidden beneath his polished exterior. That hatred surfaced the day Henry Johnson arrived. Henry was an elderly black man, cheerful and warm, with a cart full of culinary magic. A retired chef, Henry had spent decades perfecting his craft, and now he wanted to share it with the world, or at least with this neighborhood. His food cart was modest but inviting, painted in bright colors with a hand-painted sign that read, "Henry's Best Burgers." It rolled into the neighborhood on a quiet afternoon, and by the end of the day, its presence was impossible to ignore. The smell of sizzling patties, caramelizing onions, and fresh, toasted buns wafted through the streets, pulling people out of their homes. Curious at first, they approached the cart, greeted by Henry's booming laugh and a warm, genuine smile. "Come on, folks, you've never had a burger like mine," he called out, flipping patties on the small grill built into the cart. "Fresh ingredients, secret seasoning. You'll be back for more, I promise." Skeptical but intrigued, the neighbors ordered their first burgers, and then their second. Henry was right. These weren't just burgers. They were an experience. Thick, juicy, perfectly seasoned patties, paired with crisp lettuce, ripe tomatoes, and a sauce so good it left people guessing what was in it. Word spread quickly. Within days, people were coming from blocks away, forming a line at Henry's cart every evening. Families laughed together as they waited. Children danced to the upbeat music Henry played. And neighbors who rarely spoke before now bonded over their shared love for the burgers. It was as if Henry's cart had breathed new life into the neighborhood. But not everyone was happy. Frank watched it all unfold from his window, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the curtains so tightly that they began to tear. He didn't step outside. He didn't even wave when his closest neighbors passed by with their burgers, humming in satisfaction. Instead, he stood there, his face dark with resentment. "Why is everyone so obsessed with him?" he thought, glaring at the old man who stood at the center of the crowd, flipping burgers with practiced ease. Frank felt a deep bitterness. It wasn't just about the food. It was about what Henry represented. He didn't belong here, not in Frank's neighborhood, not among his people. The laughter outside grated on Frank's nerves. The music from Henry's cart was too loud, the smell of burgers too strong. And the crowds? They were a nuisance. Frank told himself all these things to justify the anger bubbling inside him. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the music or the smell or the people. It was Henry. That evening, Frank stood on his porch, watching the crowd around Henry's cart. He sneered at the sight of the old man smiling, laughing, and serving food with such ease. Frank hated how much people loved him. "This is my street," he muttered under his breath. "Not his. I'll show him." Frank's hatred grew with every burger Henry sold. It was a hatred born of prejudice, jealousy, and an overwhelming need to be in control. As far as Frank was concerned, there was only room for one beloved figure in this neighborhood, and it wasn't going to be Henry. And so as the sun set and the laughter of his neighbors faded into the night, Frank began to plot. What started as frustration was quickly turning into something much darker. Henry had no idea what kind of man he was dealing with. Frank's bitterness festered like an open wound. Every evening, the sight of Henry's food cart surrounded by happy neighbors gnawed at him. It was as if Henry's success mocked him, challenged his status as the pillar of the community. Frank felt invisible for the first time in years, and it enraged him. "Why does he get all the attention?" Frank muttered to himself, pacing his living room late one night. The faint sound of laughter outside only made his anger burn hotter. "I've been here for 20 years. I've worked hard to make this neighborhood what it is. And now this outsider comes in and takes it all away?" Frank wasn't the kind of man to confront someone directly, at least not in front of an audience. He knew how to play the role of the likable neighbor too well to risk his reputation, but the resentment was too much to ignore. The more he thought about Henry, the more he convinced himself that the old man was some kind of invader. Frank believed Henry's cart didn't just sell food, it threatened the order of the neighborhood, and Frank prided himself on being the unspoken guardian of that order. The next morning, Frank decided to take action. It was early when Frank approached Henry's cart. The air was still cool, and the streets were quiet. Henry had just finished setting up and was lighting the grill when Frank appeared. His polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a sharp edge in his voice. "So you're the one everyone's been talking about," Frank said, stepping closer to the cart. Henry looked up, his warm smile immediately spreading across his face. "Good morning. You must be Frank. Heard a lot about you. Always organizing those neighborhood events, right? Nice to meet you." Frank ignored the handshake Henry offered. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked down at the cart, his lips curling into a sneer. "You've been busy, haven't you? Seems like every night you're out here, causing a racket, music blaring, crowds all over the place. Don't you think you're disturbing the peace?" Henry's smile faltered slightly, but he kept his tone polite. "I'm sorry if I've caused any trouble. I try to keep the music low, and folks seem to enjoy hanging out here. It's good for the neighborhood, don't you think?" Frank leaned in, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "No, I don't think it's good. This is a quiet street. We don't need a circus every night. And let me make one thing clear. I don't want you here." Henry blinked, startled by the hostility. "Sir, I'm just trying to make a living. I'm not bothering anyone." Frank's face darkened. "You're bothering me, and I'm telling you, this little operation of yours won't last long. So here's what's going to happen. I'll take a burger now, and every night after this, I expect a free one. If you don't want trouble, you'll do as I say." Henry's politeness was replaced by a quiet firmness. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. This cart is my livelihood, and I can't just give food away for free." Frank's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with menace. "You'll regret that decision, trust me." He grabbed a burger from the cart, turned on his heel, and walked away without paying, leaving Henry standing there confused and uneasy. That night, Frank sat on his porch, glaring at the lively crowd around Henry's cart. The laughter, the music, the glowing smiles, they were like a knife twisting in his gut. He couldn't stand it anymore. Grabbing a baseball bat from his garage, Frank marched down the street, his jaw set and his grip tight around the bat's handle. "Wait! If you support racism, comment 55. If you stand against it, comment 77. If you faced racism, let us know and share your story with us at our email in the channel description. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel." The scene was almost surreal. Families stood in line, chatting and laughing, while Henry worked the grill with his usual enthusiasm. No one noticed Frank until he stepped into the circle of light cast by the cart's overhead bulb. "Frank," one of the neighbors called out, surprised. "Didn't think we'd see you here." Frank ignored them. Without a word, he raised the bat and swung it hard at the cart. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering silenced the crowd instantly. Henry jumped back, startled. "Hey, what are you doing?" Frank didn't answer. He swung again, smashing the condiment trays, the grill, and the colorful sign Henry had painted by hand. The once lively cart was now a wreck of twisted metal and spilled food. "You think you can ignore me?" Frank shouted, his face twisted with rage. "I warned you. This is my neighborhood. You don't belong here." The neighbors stood frozen in shock, too stunned to react. Henry stared at the destruction, his hands trembling. The cart was his dream, his source of income, and Frank had destroyed it in seconds. When the silence became unbearable, one of the neighbors finally stepped forward. "Frank, what's wrong with you? You can't do this." Frank pointed the bat at Henry, his voice shaking with fury. "He didn't listen. I told him to leave, but he didn't listen. Now he'll learn." As the neighbors gathered around Henry to comfort him, Frank threw the bat to the ground and stormed off. From his porch later that night, he watched the shattered cart being wheeled away, a smug smile on his face. "This is just the beginning," he muttered. "He'll wish he'd never come here." Frank's hatred had consumed him entirely, and he was far from done. Frank Wilson could barely contain his fury as he watched Henry's cart spring back to life. Days after he had smashed the cart to pieces, neighbors had banded together to help Henry rebuild. And now the bright sign, though a little worn, hung proudly again. Henry's Best Burgers! Frank sat on his porch, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. The sound of laughter drifted down the street as children ran to the cart, their faces lighting up with joy at the sight of Henry flipping burgers. Families stood in line, chatting, their camaraderie a slap in the face to Frank. To him, the crowd was a reminder that his efforts had been wasted. "Why won't they just let it die?" Frank muttered under his breath. "I warned him. I smashed that thing to pieces, and here he is again, acting like nothing happened." Frank's obsession with Henry had reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just about the cart anymore. It was about control. To Frank, the very existence of Henry's success was an affront, a challenge to his unspoken authority over the neighborhood. In Frank's twisted mind, Henry's resilience wasn't admirable. It was defiance, a direct threat to the order Frank believed he upheld. "I'll fix this for good," Frank growled, retreating into his house. The next morning, Frank made his move. Sitting at his spotless kitchen table, he dialed the local health department. His voice was calm and measured, practiced to sound concerned yet sincere. "Good morning," Frank began. "I live in the suburbs, and I've noticed a food cart operating on our street for the past few weeks. At first, I thought it was a nice addition, but I've become worried about the hygiene standards." The voice on the other end was polite but professional. "Have you observed any specific violations, sir?" Frank hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, choosing his words carefully. "Well, I've eaten there a few times, and I have to say, I've been feeling unwell after every meal. I didn't think much of it at first, but I've heard others in the neighborhood complaining too. It's mostly families and kids who eat there, and I'd hate for someone to get really sick." The officer took notes, her tone growing serious. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll send an inspection team to investigate." Frank ended the call with a smug grin. That part was easy, but he knew it wasn't enough to merely report Henry's cart. He needed to ensure the inspectors would find something damning. That night, under the cover of darkness, Frank put his second plan into motion. Clad in black to avoid being seen, he crept into Henry's backyard. He had been watching Henry for weeks, and he knew exactly where the old man stored his ingredients. The shed at the back of Henry's small yard was unlocked, as it always was, its wooden doors creaking slightly as Frank pushed them open. Inside, neatly stacked containers held fresh vegetables, buns, and vacuum-sealed packs of meat. The shed smelled clean, like freshly washed produce and dry wood. Frank pulled a vial from his pocket. The liquid inside was murky, its label covered in warnings. Toxic. Not for ingestion. Handle with gloves. Frank had purchased it online from a dubious source, knowing it would spoil anything it touched. "This'll do the trick," he muttered to himself, pouring the liquid over the packs of meat first, then drenching the buns and vegetables. He made sure to spread it evenly, ensuring that no part of Henry's food supply was spared. The sour chemical smell of the liquid mingled with the fresh scent of the food, and Frank couldn't help but smirk at the irony. Once the job was done, Frank slipped back into the night, feeling a surge of satisfaction. This time, Henry wouldn't just lose his cart, he'd lose everything. The next day, Henry was in good spirits. His cart was repaired, his supplies restocked, and the community's support had given him hope. As he rolled the cart down the street, waving to familiar faces, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. But that evening, as the line around his cart grew longer, a group of officials from the local health department arrived. "Mr. Johnson?" one of them asked, holding a clipboard. Henry wiped his hands on a towel and smiled. "That's me. How can I help you?" The inspector's expression was serious. "We've received complaints about your food potentially causing illness. We'll need to conduct an inspection of your cart and your supplies." Henry's smile faded. "Complaints? That doesn't make sense. I check everything myself." "I understand, sir, but it's standard procedure," the inspector said. "We'll need to test your food." The crowd watched in silence as the inspectors began their work. They checked the cart's cleanliness, took samples of the food, and examined Henry's storage containers. Henry stood to the side, his heart pounding. He prided himself on maintaining the highest standards. There couldn't possibly be anything wrong. But then, one of the inspectors held up a sample of meat, his face grim. "This is contaminated," he said. "And it's not just the meat, the buns, the vegetables. It's all been exposed to harmful substances." Henry stared in disbelief. "That's not possible. I handled everything myself. I've never had a single complaint before." The inspector shook his head. "I'm sorry, but we have no choice. We're shutting this cart down immediately." Before Henry could protest further, two police officers approached. "Mr. Johnson, we're placing you under arrest for selling unsafe food." "What?" Henry exclaimed, panic setting in. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything wrong." But his protest fell on deaf ears. The officers handcuffed him and led him away, leaving his cart behind. The crowd, stunned into silence, could only watch as the man they had come to love was taken from them. From the shadows of his porch, Frank watched it all unfold. A smug smile spread across his face as he saw Henry being escorted to the police car. He didn't need to hear what was being said. The sight of Henry in handcuffs was enough. "I told you," Frank muttered to himself. "I warned you. You should have left while you had the chance." As the police car drove away, Frank raised his glass in a mock toast to himself. In his mind, he had won. Henry's cart was gone, his reputation destroyed, and the neighborhood was finally his again. Frank didn't know, however, that his victory was far from secure. The seeds of his downfall had already been sown, and the truth would soon come to light. Henry sat on his old couch, his hands clutching a steaming mug of tea that had long since gone cold. His home, which usually felt cozy and inviting, now seemed suffocating. He stared at the wall, his mind replaying every moment of the past week. The health inspectors shutting down his cart, the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of neighbors, the hopeless nights in jail where his reputation and livelihood seemed to vanish before his eyes. Henry had built his life around trust. His food cart wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of his dedication, his years as a chef, and his love for cooking. He treated every customer like family, every burger like a gift. But now that trust had been shattered. "None of this makes sense," he muttered to himself, setting the mug on the coffee table. He couldn't let it go. The accusations, the inspectors finding contaminated food. It was impossible. He double-checked everything every day. There had to be an explanation. As the night deepened, a thought struck him. The cameras. Months ago, a kind neighbor had helped Henry install a security system. It wasn't fancy, just a few basic cameras to watch over his backyard and shed where he stored his cart supplies. At the time, Henry had thought it was unnecessary, but now it felt like his last hope. Henry powered up his laptop, the faint hum of the machine filling the silent room. He navigated to the security footage, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the recordings. The first few hours showed nothing unusual. He watched himself wheeling the cart back into the shed, wiping it down carefully, locking the doors. As the hours ticked by in the footage, Henry grew frustrated. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the quiet stillness of his backyard at night. But then, something caught his eye. At 2:47 a.m., a shadow appeared on the edge of the screen. Henry leaned in, his heart pounding. The figure moved stealthily, sticking close to the fence line before slipping into the yard. The person wore dark clothing and moved with purpose, heading straight for the shed. Henry's breath caught as the figure opened the shed doors and stepped inside. A moment later, they pulled something from their pocket, a small bottle or vial. The figure poured its contents over the neatly stacked food containers, ensuring everything was coated. When the person turned back toward the camera for a brief moment, Henry froze. The grainy footage wasn't perfect, but the face was unmistakable. It was Frank Wilson. Henry sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. "Frank," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He did this. He sabotaged me." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Frank had destroyed his life on purpose, and he had done it with precision. It wasn't enough for Frank to intimidate or threaten him. He had gone the extra step to ruin Henry completely. But why? The answer was obvious, and it was one Henry didn't want to accept. Frank's hatred wasn't about burgers or noise or neighborhood aesthetics. It was about who Henry was. The next morning, Henry wasted no time. Clutching the laptop to his chest, he marched down to the local police station. His determination was a stark contrast to the pain and confusion he'd carried for days. Now he had proof, proof that would clear his name and expose Frank for the man he truly was. The officer on duty, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, greeted him with a cautious smile. "Mr. Johnson, how can I help you?" Henry set the laptop on the counter and opened it. "You can help by watching this," he said firmly. The officer leaned over, her expression growing serious as the footage played. Henry watched her face carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened and her brows furrowed as Frank's face appeared on the screen. When the video ended, the officer sat back in her chair, letting out a low whistle. "That's damning evidence," she said. "You're saying this man, Frank Wilson, tampered with your supplies?" Henry nodded. "He's my neighbor. He's the one who destroyed my cart the first time too. And now he's gone even further. He ruined my business, got me arrested, and tried to destroy my reputation. All because he hates me." The officer nodded grimly. "Stay here. I'm going to bring this to the detectives." Within hours, the police had a warrant to search Frank's home. Frank was sitting on his porch that afternoon, sipping a glass of whiskey, when the police arrived. He watched them pull into his driveway with a slight frown, but it didn't occur to him that they were there for him. Not until two officers stepped out of the car and walked directly toward him. "Frank Wilson," one of them said, "you're under arrest for criminal tampering, false reporting, and malicious destruction of property." Frank's frown deepened into confusion. "What? This must be some kind of mistake." The officer didn't respond, pulling out a pair of handcuffs instead. Frank's confusion turned to panic. Wait a second. What's going on here? What evidence do you have?" The officers remained silent as they cuffed him, guiding him down the porch steps. By now, neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Frank spotted familiar faces, faces that had once smiled at him and welcomed him into their homes. Now those faces were filled with shock and judgment. As Frank was led to the squad car, his eyes locked onto Henry, who stood silently at the edge of the crowd. "You think you've won, don't you?" Frank snarled. His voice dripped with venom, his polished demeanor gone. "You think this changes anything? You'll never belong here. This neighborhood doesn't want you." Henry didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was out, and Frank was finally facing the consequences of his hatred. The arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For years, Frank had been the man everyone looked up to, the man who organized events and kept the neighborhood pristine. Now he was exposed as a bitter, hateful figure who had gone to horrifying lengths to destroy someone else. Some neighbors struggled to reconcile the truth. "I can't believe it," one woman said, shaking her head. "Frank always seemed so nice." Others admitted they weren't entirely surprised. "He always had a chip on his shoulder," another neighbor said. "It's like he couldn't stand anyone who didn't fit his idea of perfect." For Henry, the support was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once stayed silent stepped forward to apologize, to donate money, to help him rebuild. Within weeks, Henry's cart was back, upgraded and better than ever. But something had changed. The day Henry reopened his cart, the turnout was massive. The line stretched down the block, filled with smiling faces eager to support him. Children laughed as they played nearby, and families chatted as they waited for their food. It should have been a moment of triumph, but Henry felt a deep sadness he couldn't shake. As he handed out burgers, he thought about everything he had endured: the destruction, the sabotage, the arrest. Frank's words echoed in his mind. "This neighborhood doesn't want you." By the end of the night, when the crowd had dispersed and the street was quiet, Henry stood alone by his cart. He stared down the empty road, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. Frank was gone, but his actions had left scars that wouldn't heal easily. Henry had won the battle, but the fight against the hatred and prejudice that allowed someone like Frank to thrive felt far from over. As he packed up his cart and began the slow walk home, Henry couldn't help but wonder, how many more Franks are out there, hiding behind their smiles? And for the first time, the thought of running his cart again didn't bring him joy. It brought only the weight of what he had lost and the pain of what he had endured. The victory, though hard-earned, felt hollow. The neighborhood had shown him kindness, but it had also revealed its cracks. And as Henry disappeared into the night, the quiet street behind him seemed to echo the unanswered question, how do you truly heal from something like this? Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive.